By the time I got off the last better-lit road and into the Bluegrass outside Lexington, Kentucky, it felt less like I was heading to a job and more like I was driving out of the part of my life that still made sense. The GPS kept insisting I was on the right route, but the road had narrowed down to 2 black lanes with no shoulder worth trusting, split-rail fences flashing in and out of my headlights, and long stretches of pasture that looked empty until a post or tree trunk jumped up at the edge of the beam. Every few minutes I passed another mailbox, another private drive vanishing into dark land I couldn't see the end of. It was the kind of country that looked open in the daytime and sealed shut at night. I'd left our place a little after 9 with hospital parking still on my shoes and the smell of disinfectant still sitting in the back of my throat. I'd been trying not to think about that all the way out there. I was trying not to think about the number I'd seen on the billing screen that afternoon, or the way Evan had looked half awake and smaller somehow, even though he was 17 and hated when anybody talked to him like a kid. I kept my phone face down in the cup holder for most of the drive, but every time the screen lit up, I felt it in my chest anyway. The sign for Briar Run Horse Farm came up on my right in the wash of my headlights and almost disappeared before I had time to read it. Just a wooden sign by a gravel entrance and a long white fence running away into the dark. I turned in, tires crackling over stone, and saw the barn lights ahead of me in pieces at first, one over a gate, one above a sliding door, one far back that only caught the corner of another roofline before the darkness swallowed the rest. The place wasn't huge in a flashy way. It was spread out in the quiet, expensive way that made everything feel farther apart than it probably was. I parked near the main barn and shut the engine off. The sudden silence rang in my ears for a second. Then, the place filled back in around me one sound at a time. A shift of weight against wood, a low thud from somewhere inside, the dry rustle of hay, insects out in the grass, something metal tapping once and then stopping. When I opened the truck door, cooler air came in with the smell of hay, horse feed, damp wood, and that heavier barn smell underneath it all. Not dirty exactly, just alive, warm, and worked in. I checked my phone before I could stop myself. No new text from the nurse station, just the reminder I'd set for the next morning and an unread message from a number tied to billing. I locked the screen and put the phone in my pocket like that would keep the rest of it from following me inside. A man stepped out from the barn aisle as I came up the gravel, broad-shouldered, older than me by at least 20 years, cap pulled low and a clipboard tucked against one side like he'd been carrying it for so long it belonged there. He looked at me, then at my truck, then back at me again. "You made it," Clint said. "Yeah, took longer than I thought," I said. "Roads out here do that," he said. That was all the greeting I got, which was fine with me. I didn't need friendly. I needed the job to be real and the paycheck to clear. He turned and started back toward the open barn door, and I followed him in. The main aisle was wide, concrete under a skin of tracked hay and dirt, with stalls on both sides and soft yellow light hanging down in pools instead of reaching cleanly end to end. I'd seen horses up close before, but not enough for any of this to feel familiar. Their heads lifted one by one as I passed. Some just watched. One snorted and shifted in the straw. Another kept chewing without looking at me at all. Leather tack hung on pegs by a side room. A hose lay coiled against the wall. A broom leaned in a corner with its handle polished smooth, where hands had used it over and over. I took in the aisle, the stall doors, the quiet order of the place, and the way every sound seemed bigger once it bounced off wood and metal. "This all yours?" I asked. "Crowell's place," he said. Not really an answer, but it told me enough. Somebody with land, somebody with money, somebody who hired men to walk his barn in the middle of the night because the horses inside were worth more than anything I owned. Clint kept moving, and I stayed a step behind him. He didn't point at everything like he was giving a tour. He moved like a man who expected me to pick things up while he was already halfway to the next task. We passed a line of stalls where the mares stood bigger through the middle, heavy and watchful. He paused long enough to check a latch, glance at a water bucket, then kept going. I did the same on my side, trying to look like I belonged there, and not like a guy mentally counting how much this shift had to pay before it stopped feeling desperate. Stay close. I'll show you what matters. So I did. I watched where he stopped and what he checked first. Stall doors, bucket levels, how a horse was standing, whether the aisle stayed clear. Little things that probably meant nothing if you didn't know better and meant a lot if you did. My body was still carrying the dull drag of the hospital and the drive, but the place had its own rhythm, and before long I was matching it without meaning to. Stop. Look. Listen. Move. We were halfway down one side when I noticed one of the mares wasn't watching us. Every other horse had tracked our movement in some way, ears turning, heads lifting, eyes following. This one stood angled in her stall, not tense, not kicking, just fixed on something farther down the barn, past Clint, past me, toward a darker section where the light didn't quite reach cleanly. I slowed without meaning to. Clint kept walking for another step before he noticed and glanced back. I looked where the mare was looking, but from where I stood, it was only shadow, boards, the dull shine of metal, and the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty. Then, sharp enough to make my shoulders tighten, a burst of kicking sounded somewhere deeper in the barn complex, hard, fast, echoing off wood and concrete, and then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. The whole place seemed to hold itself in that silence for a second afterward. Even the mare didn't move. She just kept staring down that way like she was waiting for something the rest of us hadn't heard yet. I told myself it was just a horse being a horse. New place, first night, nerves already wound too tight. That was all it had to be. But standing there in the aisle with the smell of hay and feed in the air, the overhead lights humming, and that one mare fixed on the dark like it meant something, I had my first real thought that maybe this place wasn't going to feel any more familiar by morning. Clint didn't stop at the mare that had been staring down the barn. He looked once in that direction, then kept walking like he'd either heard the kicking before or had already decided it didn't matter yet. I followed him past the last few stalls and into a smaller office space built off the main aisle. It was plain inside. Desk, 2 chairs, a wall calendar, a coffee maker that looked older than I was, and a bank of camera monitors stacked above a shelf with binders and loose papers. A dry erase board hung beside the door with names, stall numbers, times, and short notes written in a tight hand that had no interest in being neat for anybody but the person using it. Clint tapped the board with one finger. "These 3 are close," Clint said. He meant 3 mares listed in the same corner, each one marked with a stall number and a short note I didn't fully understand yet. Bagging up, restless, not eating full grain. The kind of shorthand people use when they've been doing something long enough to cut the language down to bone. "You check them every pass," he told me. I nodded like that made more sense to me than it actually did. He moved to the camera monitor and pointed things out without ceremony. Main drive, front paddocks, foaling side, back fence line. The picture on every screen was black and white and just grainy enough to make distance look wrong. A gate would glow pale. A water trough would hold light. Anything beyond that turned into shape before it turned into detail. The office opened right back into the aisle, and from there, he walked me through only the places I actually needed to know. The main barn first, because that was where most of the mares were kept. Then, the shorter path out toward the foaling barn, which sat a little farther off and quieter than the rest of the property, like somebody had built a whole separate pocket of air around it. Back inside again. A feed room with stacked bags, bins, and a dusty sweet grain smell that hit stronger than the barn did. A wash stall with drains in the concrete and metal cross ties clipped up out of the way. Paddocks nearest the main barn. Then, by pointing through a side door toward darker ground beyond the nearest fence line, the back paddock. It wasn't a tour so much as a list of things that would become my problem if I didn't remember where they were. "What counts as a problem?" I asked. "If you have to ask twice, call me," he said. That answer irritated me a little, mostly because I already knew it wasn't meant to. It was the kind of line a man says after too many nights where somebody else has tried to be independent at the wrong time. I made my first real round with him trailing just behind, enough to see if I missed anything obvious. I checked latches, looked at water buckets, watched how the horses were standing. Some had that heavy, settled look of animals already halfway into their night. Others stayed aware of me, ears shifting, eyes bright under the lights. Clint didn't narrate much. He let the place do that for him. The metal click of a latch seating right, the slosh when a bucket was still full enough, the soft drag of straw under a hoof. The difference between a horse resting and a horse being strange was apparently something I was expected to learn by seeing enough of both. I could learn that, or at least I told myself I could. I'd learned warehouses, delivery routes, loading docks, inventory software, and 3 different kinds of supervisors who all thought acting tired was a moral failure. A night shift on a horse farm wasn't magic. It was a checklist in a different building. That thought held for maybe 10 minutes at a time. Then my mind kept slipping back to the hospital room. To Evan, not really asleep, not really awake, his eyes half open under the TV glow when I'd left that afternoon. To the machine sounds and the tubes and the stupid little paper cup of ice chips on the tray. He wasn't dying. That was what everybody kept saying. Stable, responding, improving. Words built to calm people who were about to be billed into the ground anyway. Our father had been dead 2 years, and our mother had been gone from the real part of our lives a whole lot longer than that. By the time Evan hit his teens, I'd stopped thinking of myself as his brother in any normal way. I was the one the school called, the one who got the phone call from a neighbor or a coach, or a kid I didn't know using Evan's phone to tell me there'd been a fight, or he'd been drinking, or he needed a ride, or he'd done something stupid and needed me to show up and make it less stupid. After a while, every emergency started sounding a little rehearsed. That was the ugly truth of it. By the time the real one happened, I'd already trained myself to hear drama first and danger second. I pushed that thought away and checked another water bucket. "Anybody else here tonight?" I asked. "Just you after I leave," he said. I looked back toward the office, then toward the dark, beyond the open side door that led out toward the farther fencing and fields. A whole property changes size when you realize it's all yours for the next several hours. Every distance gets longer. Every decision gets heavier. Clint must have seen it on my face because he kept going without waiting for me to say anything else. He showed me where the flashlight chargers were, where the spare halters hung, where the logbook stayed open on the desk. Rounds were simple enough on paper. Time, area checked, anything off. If a mare looked more restless than before, write it down. If a gate needed attention, write it down. If a water bucket was low, handle it and write it down. If something looked wrong and stayed wrong, call him. No heroics, no freelancing, just keep the place straight until morning. That should have made me feel better. Systems usually do. If a thing has steps, it has edges. If it has edges, you can keep it from spilling everywhere. But every system depends on one ugly assumption, which is that the night is going to behave the way the day told you it would. We looped back through the main barn and stopped near the office again. Clint checked his watch, then the board, then one of the camera screens. "It's easy work if nothing goes wrong," Clint said. "And if something does?" I asked. He looked at the monitor for another second before answering. "Then you don't get cute," he said. I knew men like that, men who never wasted a bigger sentence where a smaller one would do. I also knew when somebody was trying not to say more than they wanted to. That was answer enough for the moment. I signed where I had to sign, took the keyring when he handed it over, and looked once more at the board with the 3 close mares written in the corner. The numbers in my head did what they'd been doing all week. Rent, gas, hospital parking, medication, the bill that wasn't even the whole bill yet. I didn't need to like the place. I needed the shift and then the next one after that, and probably a few more after that too. That was the part of desperation nobody talks about, right? It doesn't usually feel dramatic. It feels practical, quiet, like deciding not to flinch when something in your gut already wants to. I made one more slow pass down the aisle while Clint gathered his things. The mares shifted and breathed and watched me in their own separate ways. The barn still smelled like hay, feed, leather, dust, and warm animal heat. Ordinary things, working things, the kind of details that should have kept everything grounded. But when I got near the same stall as before, I saw that Mare still had her head turned toward the darker end of the barn. Not panicked, not moving, just watching. I didn't know what to make of that yet. I only knew I felt it again, that same light tension under the ribs, the feeling that the place wasn't openly wrong but wasn't settled either, like it was waiting for the rest of the night to properly start. I told myself I could handle uneasy. Uneasy didn't pay hospital bills, but it didn't stop me from trying either. And standing there with Clint almost gone, keys in my hand, and the whole shift about to become mine, I understood the shape of the choice I actually had. I could leave because the place made me uncomfortable, or I could stay because uncomfortable was cheaper than what waited for me back in town. Clint was almost out the door when he stopped, like he'd remembered something he didn't want to remember. He had his keys in one hand and the clipboard tucked under his arm again. The office light flattened everything in there. The board, the binders, the coffee stains on the desk. The phone sitting in its cradle like it belonged to another decade. For a second, he just stood there looking at the board, not at me, and I got the feeling I was about to hear the part of the job nobody led with unless they had to. "There's a few things you do exactly the way I tell you," Clint said. "Like what?" I asked. "Like not acting smarter than the night," he said. It was one of those lines that would have sounded stupid from almost anybody else. From him, it didn't. Not because it made sense, but because he said it like he'd already seen somebody make the mistake of laughing first. He set the clipboard down and walked back out into the aisle. I followed him without thinking about it. He didn't go toward the front of the barn or the side door to the lot. He went deeper, toward the narrower stretch where the aisle bent into the section that faced the path over to the foaling barn. The mares nearest that end had the same quiet, watchful look I'd already started noticing. Like they weren't nervous exactly, just aware in a way that made me feel late to something. Clint stopped near the end of the aisle and kept his eyes on the darker opening beyond. "If you hear kicking from the foaling barn after 1, check the aisle first," he said. He said it with the same tone he'd used for bucket levels and stall checks, and that was what made it land wrong. "And?" I asked. "Count to 10 before you look into the stall," he said. I looked past him toward the farther building, then back at him again. He didn't blink, didn't wait for me to joke about it, didn't do anything that would have made it easier to treat like a hazing line for the new guy. I tried anyway, at least in my own head. Maybe mares got themselves worked up easier late at night. Maybe there was some practical reason to give 10 seconds to settle before you looked in and made things worse. That explanation was thin, but it was better than the alternative, which was that he meant exactly what it sounded like he meant. We turned back toward the side door, and he pushed it open with one shoulder. Night air came in cooler there. Beyond the nearest fence, the paddocks fell off into black ground and weak patches of spill light from the barn. The farther line of fencing was barely more than pale rails drawn against dark pasture. Clint pointed out toward the back. "If something's standing at the back fence and it won't turn when you call, don't call again," he said. That one made me look at him harder than the first one had. "Why?" I asked. "Because if it turns the second time, you won't want it looking at you," he said. There are ways people say things when they're trying to scare you for fun. There's always a shape to that. A little pause, a little satisfaction, a hint that they're waiting to see whether you bite. Clint didn't have any of that in him. He sounded irritated that he had to say it at all. That bothered me more than if he'd smiled. He pulled the door shut and kept walking. I stayed close because at that point, I wasn't sure whether the smart move was to call him on the whole thing or just keep listening until I understood what game he thought we were playing. He led me past the office and stopped at the feed room. The door was shut, feed dust settled along the lower hinge, and the jam where it had built up from years of opening and closing. He put a hand on the door, but didn't open it. "If that feed room door's open and you didn't open it, don't go in," he said. That one sounded more practical, or at least close enough to it for half a second. A horse could have gotten loose. Somebody could have left it open. A latch could have slipped. "You serious?" I asked. "Listen first," he said. He finally looked at me then, and there wasn't anything dramatic in his face, just a kind of tired insistence. "If you hear chewing, shut it and walk away." I thought about asking him what exactly was supposed to be chewing in there if I knew I hadn't opened the door and didn't want to know the answer badly enough to hear him give it. The smell coming off the room was sweet grain, dry bags, old wood, and something else underneath, faint and stale. Perfectly normal as far as I could tell. The problem was that the rest of the conversation wasn't. He moved on before I could push it. We stopped across from the wash stall, where the concrete changed texture and the metal fittings on the wall caught the light in short, cold gleams. Water stains marked the floor around the drain. A mare in the nearest stall had her head raised and ears tipped in our direction, not toward us, but toward that open wash space beyond us. Clint followed my glance. "If one of the mares won't stop watching the wash stall, you wait," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For her to look away on her own," he said. I let that sit there for a second. By then, skepticism had started to split in two inside me. One half still wanted to dismiss the whole thing as local superstition, the kind that grows in workplaces where the same people do the same shift long enough to turn pattern into ritual. The other half had started noticing how specific all of it was, not broad warnings, not vague bad feelings, exact actions, exact times, exact responses. That was what kept me from brushing it off cleanly. Back in the office, Clint picked up the clipboard again, checked his watch, and glanced at the phone on the desk. "If that phone rings between 3:13 and 3:33, let it ring once," he said. That was the one that finally broke through enough for me to almost laugh. "You're messing with me," I said. "I'm not," he said. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. That was the first rule that had nothing to do with a horse, a stall, a door, a fence, or anything else I could tie to the actual job. It just sat there, raw and wrong, right in the middle of a barn office. "And if it rings again?" I asked. "Pick it up," he said. Then he added the part that made the room feel smaller. "Don't say your name first." I looked at the phone. Beige plastic, curled cord, a strip of tape with some number written on it in black marker. The kind of phone I wouldn't have thought twice about anywhere else. I thought about telling him that if somebody called in the middle of the night, I knew how to answer a damn phone. I thought about asking what possible difference a name made. But by then I already knew he wouldn't explain it in any way that would satisfy me. The only thing left that made sense was asking the question underneath all the others. "Who had this job before me?" I asked. "Brett Tolland," Clint said. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it did. No hesitation, no searching, just a man he already had in mind. "What happened to him?" I asked. "He stopped coming in," Clint said. That was all. No story about a better offer, no shrug about unreliable help, no casual line about a guy quitting midweek. Just that. He stopped coming in. The shape of the sentence stayed with me because it sounded like the end of a process, not the start of one. Like whatever had happened to Brett had happened first, and the not coming in had only been what people called it afterward. Clint picked up his keys again and tucked the clipboard under his arm. The office suddenly felt too small for both of us and too big for me alone. The board with the mare names on it, the grainy camera screens, the phone, the open logbook waiting for times and notes I hadn't written yet. I wanted to tell him the whole thing sounded insane. I wanted to tell him if he had real instructions, he should give them to me straight. But the truth was, men don't usually invent rules like that unless they need them for something. Not 5 of them. Not that specific. And not with that same flat delivery every time. Like each one had already been tested somewhere I couldn't see. He walked out of the office and into the aisle, and I followed him as far as the main barn door. The lot outside was darker now that my eyes had adjusted to the interior lights. My truck sat where I'd left it, and beyond it, the fence lines and pasture had gone soft again around the edges. Clint stepped out into the gravel and turned back once. He didn't add anything, didn't soften any of it, didn't tell me to relax or say it would probably be a quiet night. Then he got in his truck, backed out, and drove off down the lane, his headlights sweeping the fence before disappearing past the gate. After that, the whole property belonged to the sounds it had been making before I got there. A hoof shifting in straw, the hum of the lights, the faint tick of cooling metal somewhere overhead. I went back into the office and looked at the board, then at the camera screens, then at the phone again. 5 rules, all too strange to trust, all too exact to ignore, and I was alone with them. Once Clint's headlights were gone, the farm settled into a different kind of quiet than the one it had while he was still there. It wasn't louder. If anything, it got more controlled. Every small sound had more room around it. A horse shifting in straw, water moving faintly when a muzzle bumped a bucket, the low electrical hum above the office ceiling, my own boots on the aisle concrete. When there's another person on a property with you, even if they're somewhere else, some part of your brain stays leaned on that fact. Once that's gone, the place changes shape. I stood in the office for another few seconds than I needed to, looking at the board, the cameras, the phone, then the board again. 5 rules sat in the back of my mind like splinters. I didn't want to think about them because thinking about them made them feel more legitimate than they deserved. So I did what people always do when they don't want to look directly at a thing. I worked. The first round alone went cleaner than I expected. I checked the same stalls Clint had shown me, paused a little longer at the 3 mares marked on the board, and made myself slow down enough to do it right. Water first. Latches. The way each mare was standing. The aisle itself. I logged the time when I went back through the office and wrote it down in the same clip style as the entries above mine. Aisle clear. Water good. Mares alert, quiet. The pen felt dry and cheap in my hand. Then I checked the cameras again. Main drive empty. Front paddock still. Back fence line washed out in grain and weak contrast. Folding side looked normal enough from that angle, just a stretch of building and pale fence, and light falling where it fell. I told myself that was the job. That was all this had to be. A long night, a lot of walking, a few notes on a board, a paycheck on the other end. A man says 5 strange things to you in a barn office late at night, and your mind does what minds do. It gives those things more weight than they deserve because you're tired and new and alone. I went back into the main aisle and made another pass. The mares tracked me with slow eyes and small ear movements. One had kicked straw up against her door. Another had finished most of her hay and was nosing around for what was left. The mare that had been watching down the darker end of the barn earlier had changed position, but not by much. She wasn't staring now. That should have made me feel better. Instead, I found myself noticing that I'd been looking for it. Around midnight, the rhythm started getting into my body. Check, move, listen, repeat. It was the kind of work that could almost make you forget time if you let it. My shoulders loosened. My breathing settled. I stopped feeling like I was visiting somebody else's job and started feeling like I was at least borrowing it for the night. That was when my phone buzzed in my pocket and yanked me right back out of it. I took it out under the office light. A hospital billing alert. Not even a person, just a payment reminder and a number I didn't have. For a second, I stared at the screen hard enough to make the letters blur. I thought about Evan lying in that room, about the way his voice had sounded on the phone that night. Not dramatic, not loud, just thin in a way I'd heard before and decided not to believe. I locked the screen and shoved the phone away harder than I meant to. I made another round after that just to have something to do with the restless feeling under my ribs. The barn stayed mostly the same. The air felt a little cooler near the doors and warmer farther down the aisle. A few of the mares had settled more heavily into themselves. One let out a long breath through her nose that made me jump anyway, because my nerves had gone tighter than I wanted to admit. When I went back into the office again, the digital clock on the desk was showing a little after 1 a.m. I saw it, registered it, thought without wanting to about what Clint had said regarding the foaling barn after 1. Then I made myself look at the logbook instead. That lasted maybe 3 minutes. The sound hit hard enough to cut through the wall and the office door, both. A burst of kicking from the direction of the foaling barn. Not one strike. A fast series of them, heavy and hollow against wood, the kind of sound that made you picture 1,000 pounds of animal throwing itself in the dark. I was out of the chair before I knew I'd moved. The yard between the two barns looked different at that hour, more open and less visible at the same time. The gravel gave under my boots as I crossed. A yard light caught the side of the foaling barn and left the rest of it in a dim wash that seemed to flatten the doorway and deepen everything past it. The kicking had already stopped by the time I got there. That should have made it feel less urgent. It didn't. I stepped inside the foaling aisle and stopped. The air in there was warmer and held a slightly sweeter smell under the hay and wood. It was quieter than the main barn, more contained. The stalls ran in a short line, and one of them down the row had a mare inside, standing completely still. Rule 1 rose in my head so fast it irritated me. If you hear kicking from the foaling barn after 1, check the aisle first. I was in the aisle. Fine. Done. Do not look into the stall until you've counted to 10. Standing there in that warmer, too quiet space, I felt stupid even thinking about it. I was a grown man in a work jacket about to count in the dark because another man with a flat voice and a clipboard had told me to. It was absurd. I knew it was absurd. I still did it. 1, 2, I said. My own voice sounded small in there, not weak exactly, just not built for that space. I kept my eyes on the aisle boards, the floor, the edges of the stall door. Anywhere but inside. By 4, I felt embarrassed. By 6, I wanted to stop. By 8, I was aware of how hard I was listening for movement that wasn't coming. 10, I said. Then I looked in. At first, I thought the mare was facing the wall. That was wrong enough on its own to snag my attention. She stood angled deeper in the stall with her body turned away from me, and her head set so strangely still that for 1/2 second, my brain didn't read it as a living posture at all. It read it as arrangement, like pieces placed where they shouldn't be. The line of her back looked off. Her neck looked too long for the angle I was seeing it from. And there was something about the dark along the far wall that made the stall seem crowded in a way it shouldn't have been, like there was more shape in it than one horse and straw should account for. I didn't move. I think that was the coldest part of it, not that I saw something clearly impossible. I didn't. It was that my body locked before my mind had finished deciding what it was seeing. Then the mare shifted. Just one small adjustment of weight and a turn of the head enough to break the angle. At the same time, I blinked, and the whole thing came back together into something I could almost explain. A mare standing off to one side, shadow stacked wrong in the corner, light from the aisle catching only part of her body. That was all. It had to be all. Easy. I said. I wasn't sure if I meant her or me. She turned her head a little more then, and I could finally see one eye catch the light. Normal eye. Normal shine. Her ears flicked once. Her breathing looked even. No fresh sign of panic, no sweat, no wild movement. If she'd been the one kicking, she wasn't acting like it now. I stood there longer than I needed to, trying to feel stupid enough to get over it. Exhaustion, I told myself. New place, bad angles. Horses looked different in stall light than they did out in the open or under full daylight. I didn't know enough yet to trust my first impression. That was all this was. People see the wrong thing in low light all the time and scare themselves with it. I checked the rest of the foaling aisle, found nothing that justified the sprint over there, and walked back outside slower than I'd come. Gravel underfoot, cool air again, the office door ahead. Ordinary things, useful things. I held onto them on purpose. Back inside, I wrote down the time and a line about hearing kicking from the foaling barn and finding the mare settled by the time I arrived. I almost added more. Didn't. I sat the pen down and looked at the cameras again, even though nothing on them had changed. Rule 1 wasn't funny anymore. I wouldn't give it that much. But I also wasn't ready to hand it the whole night. Not after one look in a stall, one bad angle, one moment where a horse had seemed arranged wrong before turning back into a horse. So I stayed with the explanation that cost me less. Bad light, bad timing, a tired mind trying to build something out of shadow. That was what I told myself. It just wasn't what I felt when I thought about looking in before I'd counted to 10. By the time I finished writing the note in the logbook, I'd already started doing the thing people do when they don't want to admit they've been rattled. I was trying to absorb the moment into procedure. Hear something, check it, find nothing, write it down, move on. If I kept the shape of the night ordinary, maybe it would stay that way. It didn't. I made another pass through the main barn, slower this time, partly because I wanted to prove to myself I could. The mares were where they were supposed to be. Water buckets looked fine. Latches were seated. The barn had gone back to its regular sounds, if there even was such a thing as regular out there. A hoof shifting, straw dragging, a low breath through a horse's nose. Small noises with enough quiet around them to make each one matter. When I got back to the office, I checked the camera bank again. That was where I saw it. The back paddock camera was the worst one on the wall. Grainy even by the standards of the others, a little too washed out in the center and too dark along the edges. Fence line, a stretch of open ground, then black. At first, I thought the pale vertical shape near the back fence was just one of the posts catching light wrong. Then, it moved just enough for the outline to separate itself. A horse, or what looked enough like one at that distance to make my stomach drop before my brain had time to catch up. It was standing at the far fence with its body turned away from the camera and its head pointed toward the rails, like it had walked out there and stopped to stare through them at nothing. It wasn't grazing. It wasn't pacing. It was just there. I looked at the clock without meaning to. Still early enough in the night for me to want badly to explain everything with work and timing and bad luck. I stood up, took the flashlight off its hook, and stepped outside. The air felt colder than before. Not by much, but enough to register on the skin at the back of my neck. Gravel shifted under my boots as I crossed toward the nearer paddocks and followed the fence line around. The farther I got from the spill of the barn lights, the flatter everything looked. Rails, grass, shadow, open land. The flashlight cut a narrow tunnel ahead of me, not enough to own the dark, just enough to make me more aware of how much of it stayed outside the beam. By the time I reached a point where I could see into the back paddock better, the shape was still there. Same position, same stillness. It looked larger in person than it had on the screen, though that might have just been the distance playing tricks on me. I couldn't make out markings or exactly which horse it was, just the outline of the hindquarters, the back, the neck disappearing toward the fence. Rule 2 came back word for word. and I hated that it did. If a horse in the back paddock is facing the fence and won't turn when you call, don't call a second time. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and told myself it was still just a horse standing wrong in the dark. So I called once. "Hey!" I called. My voice went out over the fence and into the dark pasture and sounded thinner than it had in my head. The shape didn't move, not a twitch of the ear, not a shift of weight, nothing. I took another step closer to the fence, lifted the flashlight a little higher, and felt my mouth opening again before I stopped it. The second call was already there, almost out, a reflex more than a decision. Clint's line hit me at the exact second I was about to say it. Because if it turns the second time, you won't want it looking at you. That was ridiculous. I knew it was ridiculous, but I stood there with my jaw set, heart working harder than it should have been, and couldn't make myself say another word. Instead, I tried to identify the horse by shape. Too far, wrong angle, light breaking over the fence and dying before it reached the head. It could have been one of the mares. It could have been a trick of distance. It could have been something that only looked motionless because I was too far away to catch the smaller shifts. It still wasn't moving. "Come on," I said. The second the words left my mouth, I knew I'd pushed closer to that line than I should have. Maybe it wasn't a full call. Maybe that was just me trying to feel better about it. Either way, the shape at the fence stayed fixed. I stayed there a few seconds more, long enough for the cold and the silence to start working together in a way I didn't like. Then I turned and went back to the barn faster than I wanted to admit. Inside, the air felt too warm. I went straight to the board in the office. Rule 2 had sounded stupid when Clint gave it to me. Stupid and theatrical. The kind of thing old hands on a property tell each other because they've been spending too many nights alone in the same place. But if I could settle it with the board, then I could kill the rest of it right there. I checked the names, stall numbers, and the paddock notes written in the lower section, counted once, counted again. Then I looked up at the camera monitor, then back to the board. The count was right. That was the first hard break in the night for me. Not the foaling barn, not the shape in the stall. This. Every horse that was supposed to be accounted for was accounted for. The mares in their stalls were in their stalls. The turnout numbers on the board matched the paddocks they were supposed to be in. There was no missing animal that should have been standing at the far fence by itself. I looked back at the screen. The shape was still there. Part of me tried to argue that the board was wrong, or that I was reading it too fast, or that the camera angle had fooled me. Then why had it looked like a horse the second I saw it? I checked the board one more time anyway, tracing the entries with my finger like that would change them. It didn't. The count stayed right, which meant one of two things. Either there was a horse in that back paddock that wasn't supposed to exist, or I was seeing something I couldn't trust enough to name. Neither answer helped. I made myself log a note without getting specific enough to sound crazy. Checked back paddock after visual on camera. Head count appears correct. Will recheck. I stared at the sentence after I wrote it. Appears correct. Even then I was trying to leave myself an escape hatch. I didn't go back outside right away. I stayed in the office, eyes flicking from the monitors to the board to the phone and back again. The whole place had started to feel arranged around small choices I didn't understand. Look or don't. Call or don't. Go out there again or don't. Each one felt stupid until I was the one making it. After a while, I forced myself into another round. Standing still wasn't helping. It was making the office feel like a lookout post over something I wasn't equipped to watch. The main barn looked normal again in all the ways that now mattered less. The mares were calm. The aisle was clear. One kicked her stall once, quick and irritated, then settled. I checked the 3 Clint had pointed out earlier and found nothing I could justify writing down beyond the basics. I moved on to the side of the barn where the feed room sat and stopped. The door was open, not wide, maybe 3 inches, just enough to break the line of the frame and show a wedge of darkness inside. I knew I'd shut it earlier. not because I had some perfect memory for doors, but because Clint had stood there and put his hand on it while he gave me the rule. After that, I'd noticed the latch when I made my round. Shut. I would have sworn to that much. My first instinct was the plainest one. Someone hadn't pulled it all the way, and it drifted. Old buildings settled, hinges shifted, doors moved. There was nothing supernatural about a feed room door sitting wrong in the middle of the night. Then I remembered the rest of what he'd said, and the fact that I was already standing still instead of just pushing it open told me more than I wanted to know. If that feed room door's open and you didn't open it, don't go in. I stood outside it and listened. At first, all I could hear was the barn, air, a distant shift from one of the stalls, my own breathing, louder because I wanted it quieter. Then, from inside the room, something made a wet, slow working sound, chewing, not quick tearing, not grain rattling in a bucket, not a horse pulling hay and grinding it down. This was slower than that, heavier, deliberate, like whatever was doing it wasn't in any hurry at all. The sound stopped, then started again. A stupid amount of fear can fit into a person in the space of one small sound. Not a scream, not a crash, just something eating where nothing should be eating. I should have opened the door. That was the ordinary move. Catch the loose animal, fix the problem, move on. That was what I would have told myself in any other building on any other night. Instead, I put my hand on the edge of the door and eased it shut. The latch clicked. I stood there another second, waiting for something inside to react to being closed in. A kick, a shove, a sound of movement against bags or wood. Nothing came. The silence afterward was somehow worse than the chewing had been. Then I walked away. Not fast, not running. Just walking like I still had control of the night and the night was still interested in pretending I did. Back in the office, I didn't sit down right away. I watched the camera bank and listened to the barn until my breathing settled a little. The shape at the back fence and the sound in the feed room had changed the place for me. Every room and stall now felt like something could get there before I did. That was the shift, and it wasn't in the barn. It was in me. Up until then, I'd still been working from the assumption that I was tired, new, and suggestible. That if I kept my head level long enough, the place would go back to being a farm with horses and paperwork and a weird old hand who liked dramatic instructions. But the board had said the count was right, and something inside that feed room had been chewing anyway. From that point on, I didn't follow the rules because I believed in them. I followed them because I was afraid not to. I made it through the rest of the first night by keeping to the routine. Stalls, water, logbook, cameras. I stayed in the lit parts of the barn and didn't give myself room to think any harder than I had to. By the time morning started to show around the edges of the windows, I had stopped asking whether the rules were real and started asking a simpler question. Could I afford to quit? That answer came faster than I wanted it to. I drove back into town with grit on my boots, hay dust on my sleeves, and the smell of the barn still stuck in my jacket. My eyes burned the whole way. I kept telling myself I was done. I'd call Clint after I got some sleep and tell him the job wasn't for me. I'd make something up if I had to. Better that than spend another night walking around a place where the dark seemed to know how to arrange itself around me. Then I went to the hospital. Evan was awake when I got there, though not fully. He looked over when I came in, gave me that half-recognizing, half-guarded look he'd had since all this started, then looked back at the TV mounted in the corner like it mattered. The room smelled like antiseptic, plastic, and overheated air. He had a cup of ice on the tray table and hadn't touched most of it. There were still color and numbers on the monitor beside him, which should have been reassuring and somehow never were. We didn't talk much. He was tired, and I was too tired to fake normal for longer than a couple minutes at a time. I asked how he was feeling. He said better. I asked if he needed anything. He said no. It was the kind of exchange that only works if both people agree not to mention the larger thing sitting in the room with them. The bill, the guilt, the fact that if I'd gone when he called that night, maybe none of this would have happened the way it did. On my way back to the parking garage, my phone buzzed with a payment reminder. That was the end of my plan to quit. By that evening, I had slept just enough to feel worse instead of better. My head felt packed with cotton. My body had that off-balance night shift heaviness where food didn't seem useful and time stopped moving in the right order. But I still left a little after 9 and drove back out into the Bluegrass outside Lexington, because numbers are crueler than fear most of the time. The second night started more quietly than the first, which only made me trust it less. Clint was there long enough to hand the shift off and go over the board. His eyes stayed on the mares, the clock, the pen in his hand. He didn't ask how the first night had gone, and I didn't volunteer anything. If he expected me not to come back, he didn't say that either. He just gave me the updates that mattered, told me which mare had been more restless earlier, then left me with the keys and the board and the same dry expression he seemed to wear for everything. After he drove off, I did exactly what I'd done the night before. I worked, stalls first, water, latches, camera check, aisle clear, keep moving. For a while, the farm almost let me believe it had reset. Then I got halfway down the main barn and saw the chestnut mare in stall 12 staring across the aisle at the wash stall. It wasn't a casual look. It wasn't the loose, curious attention horses gave everything that moved. She had both ears forward and her neck angled just enough that I could tell she'd been holding that position a while. Not rigid, not frantic, fixed. Rule 4 came back into my head at once. If one of the mares keeps watching the wash stall, do not cross in front of her stall door until she looks away on her own. I stopped in the aisle and looked from her to the wash stall and back again. The wash stall was empty, cross ties hanging, hose looped, floor marked with old water stains and nothing else. No sound, no motion, no reason to be standing there respecting a rule that sounded like somebody's private superstition. I still didn't move. That was the part I hated most. The rules had already gotten into my body before I'd decided they deserved to. The mare kept staring. "Come on," I said. She didn't even flick an ear toward me. I stayed where I was and waited, feeling stupid in the exact way Clint had probably known I would. Time stretches differently when you're waiting for something that shouldn't need waiting. My calves started to ache a little from standing still. I became aware of the overhead lights buzzing. A horse farther down the aisle shifted in straw and then settled again. The chestnut mare never took her eyes off the wash stall. Then I heard water. Not a steady run, just a drip, slow, irregular, one drop, then several seconds, then another. I looked over. No faucet was on, no hose had come loose. The sound kept going anyway. A few seconds later, something metal clicked against metal. One of the hanging clips in the wash stall moved just enough to tap and settle, like it had been brushed by a hand or shoulder passing too close. There was no breeze, no horse, no person. I knew that because I could see the whole opening from where I stood. I should have backed away right then. Instead, I shifted my weight and started to move as if I could cross in front of the stall just a little, not enough to count as breaking the rule. That was the lie I told myself in the moment, that small violations didn't count. As I moved, I glanced down at the wash stall floor. There was a thin, dark patch of moisture on the concrete that shouldn't have been there, not fresh enough to be wet from use, not old enough to be only stain. In that patch, under the angle of the overhead light, I saw a reflection that didn't match the room. The floor was reflecting the ties, the walls, the light above. It was also reflecting the lower edge of a shape standing just outside the frame of the stall itself. Not detailed, not clear. just the vertical suggestion of something present where nothing visible was standing. I snapped my head up toward the actual stall. Nothing. When I looked back down, the reflection was only light on old concrete. The chestnut mare hit her stall door so hard it sounded like somebody had kicked a car panel. The whole barn jumped with her. Wood slammed, metal rang. A mare across the aisle snorted and backed into her corner. Another kicked once, then twice, and the sound bounced down the aisle until the whole place seemed to wake up at once. That was the first moment the consequences turned real. Not vague anymore. Not something I could write off as nerves. One bad move from me and the calm was gone. I worked the aisle on instinct after that. Voice steady, hands low, no fast movements. Keep enough distance not to feed the panic, but not so much that it spread. It took a few minutes to settle the mares down again, and the whole time I was aware of the wash stall behind me without wanting to look at it. When the barn finally quieted, I looked across at the wash stall once more. It was empty, ordinary, dead still. That helped less than it should have. I finished the rest of night 2 with a tighter rhythm than before, and none of the illusion that I was just learning an unfamiliar property. The rules weren't there to make the night feel spooky. They had consequences attached to them, whether I understood those consequences or not. By dawn, I was ready to walk. Then, the day happened again. Hospital room, parking charges, Evan too tired to talk long, the look on his face when he tried not to look sick. I almost called Clint from the lot, almost told him I was done. Instead, I drove home, slept badly, and came back for night 3. The office felt too normal when I came in. That was the first thing I noticed. The desk, the board, the camera screens, the beige office phone sitting in its cradle like it had no business mattering to anybody. I worked the early part of the shift without incident and kept checking the clock against my own will. When it rolled into the 3 a.m. hour, my whole body started waiting before my mind admitted it was. At 3:17 a.m., the phone rang. One clean ring. I let it pass. The silence after it was so complete, I could hear the faint hum in the monitor screens. Then, the phone rang again. I picked it up and said nothing. For a second, there was only dead air. Then, breathing. Thin and uneven, close enough to the mouthpiece that it felt intimate in the worst possible way. Then, a voice said, "Landon." My hand tightened around the receiver. It wasn't exactly Evan's voice. That was what made it worse. If it had been perfect, I could have called it a trick immediately. Instead, it was too close in the places that matter when you've known somebody your whole life. The same strain in the throat. The same way my name flattened a little when fear was trying not to sound like fear. I still didn't answer. The line breathed once more. Then it said, "Why didn't you come?" That hit me harder than anything I'd seen on the property. Not because it proved anything cleanly. It didn't. I still couldn't have told you what was in that farm, or how it worked, or why it could do that. But in that moment I understood something worse than explanation. Whatever had been waiting on that property was no longer staying in corners I could avoid. It wasn't just in the paddock, or the feed room, or the wash stall. It had found a way to speak in a voice I would have followed anywhere. I kept the receiver to my ear a second longer than I should have. Not because I thought it was really Evan, not even because I thought there might be some explanation that could still make the whole thing small again. I kept it there because my body had already gone somewhere my mind couldn't pull back from fast enough. That was the part people don't talk about when they describe fear like it's a clean decision. It isn't. Sometimes your body chooses first and the rest of you gets dragged behind it. The line stayed open. I could hear breathing. Thin, uneven, the kind that made the space around the sound feel smaller than it should have been. I still didn't answer. Then the voice said my name again, quieter this time, and there was something in the timing of it that hit deeper than the words themselves. Evan had always had this way of speaking when he wanted something from me and didn't want to come out and say it straight. Not manipulative exactly. More like he was already bracing for me to say no before I even opened my mouth. He'd done it since he was a kid. By the time he was 15 or 16, he'd gotten good at making every problem sound like it had already crossed the line into emergency before I'd heard the first detail. That was how it had happened. Not all at once, not in one big betrayal, just over time. A call because he'd gotten into it with somebody outside a gas station and needed a ride before the cops showed up. A call because a friend's brother was drunk and wouldn't leave them alone. A call because he'd taken something from somebody's house and suddenly wanted me there before the fallout reached him. Not every call was a lie. That would have been easier in a way. Most of them were built around some smaller truth. He really was in trouble. He really did need somebody. It just usually wasn't the kind of trouble his voice made it sound like. After enough of those, urgency starts wearing down. That's the part I never stop hating in myself. Not that I ignored him once, that I learned how. I set the phone back in its cradle with more care than I felt, like if I moved too fast, the whole office might admit something openly that it was still content to keep implied. My hand was shaking. I shoved it into my jacket pocket and looked at the clock, even though I already knew what time it was. 3:17 a.m. The same narrow, dead slice of night, the same office, the same beige phone. Nothing in the room looked changed, which made the call feel worse instead of better. I tried to breathe through it, tried to reduce it to pieces, a voice on a line, a farm with old wiring and older habits, a tired mind, a trigger. That was all. I'd been carrying Evan in my head long before I ever drove out to Briar Run. It didn't take anything supernatural for guilt to find a shape to wear. Then, from somewhere outside the office, I heard a sound that made every bit of that reasoning break apart. A voice, not loud, not even clear enough to place right away, but shaped around the same strain I'd just heard over the phone. Somebody saying my name from farther down the barn, just past the point where the office light reached cleanly into the aisle. I stood up so fast the chair legs scraped hard across the floor. There are moments when you know better and move anyway. That was one of them. I was out into the aisle before I'd fully decided to go. The barn looked the same as it had a minute earlier. Stalls lined up under the lights, horses shifting now and then, quiet, heavy, present. But my hearing had changed. Every little sound now felt like it was trying to cover for the one I was actually listening for. I moved toward the darker end of the aisle, with my heart hammering in a way that made me feel stupid and young and furious at myself all at once. I knew this was bad. Knew that whatever had spoken over that phone had no business having any version of Evan's voice. Knew I was already doing the exact thing I would have warned somebody else not to do. Then I heard it again. Not my full name that time. Just a broken-off shape of it from farther down, thinned out by distance and wood and the barn's strange acoustics. For 1 second, I was back in that other night, standing in somebody else's warm house with a paper plate in one hand while my phone lit up and buzzed against the table. Looking down, seeing Evan's name, letting it ring because I was tired, because I was angry, because I thought I already knew what the problem was going to be before he said it. Then the voicemail. Then the hospital call later. 30 minutes, maybe a little more. Enough time to turn one bad choice into something that followed me every day after. The barn aisle in front of me blurred, sharpened, and blurred again. That was what this thing had found in me. Not just guilt, repetition. The exact point where guilt stopped being memory and turned into reflex. Call, delay, regret, call, delay, regret. You live inside that pattern long enough and your body starts trying to fix it before your mind can ask whether fixing it is even possible. I got almost to the end of the aisle before I caught myself. It wasn't some dramatic moment of courage. My feet just stopped. Maybe because one of the mares nearest the end lifted her head and stared past me into the dark in a way I had learned not to trust. Maybe because the air felt different there, thinner and colder where it shouldn't have been. Maybe because some last sane part of me understood that if I kept moving toward a voice I already knew wasn't real, I was handing myself over to whatever was using it. My throat felt tight enough to hurt. "You're not him," I said. The words came out rougher than I expected, too quiet for anything at the far end of the barn to need in order to hear me, if there even was anything there in the ordinary sense. But saying them mattered to me more than to the dark. It was the first thing I'd said all night that felt like choosing instead of reacting. Nothing answered. That should have helped. It didn't. Because the silence after that line wasn't empty silence. It had the same waiting quality as the phone call, as if whatever was in the farm had learned enough already and was deciding what to do with it. I backed up one step, then another, eyes never leaving the darker stretch ahead. I didn't turn around. I didn't call again. I didn't say Evan's name. But I came too close. Close enough that I knew it. Close enough that shame got braided right into the fear. That was the real cost of the third night, not just that the place had gotten stranger or bolder or more willing to use what it knew. It was that I couldn't separate the horror from my own failure anymore. Every wrong sound carried Evan in it now. Every pause on a phone line, every voice in the dark. The farm didn't need to build anything new to get at me. It just needed to touch the part of me that already believed I had once been too late and would do almost anything not to be too late again. Standing there in the aisle, breathing too hard, hands cold, I understood how a place like that could get a person without ever putting a hand on them. It only had to make you run toward the thing you couldn't bear to lose twice. I backed out of that end of the aisle one careful step at a time until I was under the fuller office light again, and only then did I let myself look away. My pulse was still hammering in my throat. My hands felt wrong, too cold and too loose at the same time, like they belonged to somebody who had just avoided putting them into machinery by half an inch. I stayed there with one hand on the office door frame and listened to the barn settle itself around me again. A horse shifted in straw. Another bumped a bucket. The old hum from the lights stayed steady overhead. Ordinary sounds, working sounds. They should have put the world back into order. They didn't. Because by then the shape of the night had changed, not in the farm, in my understanding of it. Up to that point, every rule Clint had given me had still been sitting in my head as its own separate ugly thing. The foaling barn, the back paddock, the feed room, the wash stall, the phone. 5 bad instructions for 5 bad situations. I'd been reacting to them one at a time, like maybe the place had a handful of dangerous corners and the rules were just a strange local way of moving around them. Standing there after hearing Evan's voice in the office and then again in the barn, I realized that wasn't what the rules were at all. They weren't separate. They were all doing the same job. I went back into the office and looked at the board, the logbook, the cameras, then finally the phone. I didn't sit down. I didn't trust myself to get that comfortable again. The clock on the desk had moved forward only a few minutes, but it felt like the whole property had stepped farther away from anything I could finish a shift inside. I started going back through the rules in my head, one by one, not the words themselves at first, but the action each one demanded from me. In the foaling barn, I wasn't told to leave. I wasn't told to call for help. I was told to wait before looking, to stop myself from seeing too quickly, too directly, too soon. Not because looking itself was dangerous in some broad ghost story way, but because there was apparently a difference between seeing something after a pause and seeing it at the wrong moment. A difference I had felt without understanding it when that mare in the stall had looked wrong before looking almost normal again. At the back paddock, the rule hadn't been, "Don't go out there." It had been, Don't call a second time. Don't ask again for a response. Don't invite a turn. That was what I had missed when Clint first said it. The danger wasn't that something stood at the fence. The danger was in trying to make it answer you. The feed room was the same shape once I stopped treating it like a separate problem. If the door was already open, and I didn't remember opening it, the instruction wasn't solve the mystery. It was the opposite. Don't step into something that had already been opened for you. Don't move across a threshold that had been prepared in your absence. Listen, confirm enough to leave, then close it without entering. Refuse the invitation. The wash stall too. Not don't use it, not don't look at it. Wait until the mare looks away. Let the animal lose interest before you cross. Don't step into the line of attention while something else is still fixed on it. Don't put yourself where you're being indicated. And the phone. The one that had felt out of place because it had nothing to do with horses. Suddenly, it was the clearest one of them all. Let it ring once. Then, if it rings again, answer it. But don't say your name first, not don't answer. Don't identify yourself. That was what all 5 rules had in common, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. None of them were about fighting anything off. None of them were about protecting the horses in the simple sense I'd assumed. They were all about refusing a certain kind of contact, refusing to complete something, refusing to confirm. Don't see it too early. Don't call it back. Don't enter what it opened. Don't cross where it's being pointed out. Don't give it your name. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted so suddenly it hurt, because that meant the thing on the property didn't hunt the way ordinary fear wanted it to. It wasn't just waiting in one place for somebody to stumble into it. It worked through recognition, through response, through a person finishing some small piece of the connection for it. Maybe not all at once, maybe not in one act big enough to notice, but enough. Enough for it to lock onto you more cleanly each time. That was why the rules were so specific. Not because Clint or whoever came before him was superstitious. Specificity was the whole point. Vague caution wouldn't help against something that only needed tiny permissions. I looked down at the open logbook and started turning pages backward with more force than I meant to. Most of the entries were exactly what mine had been. Times, notes, water low in stall 4, mare restless, gate chain replaced, nothing dramatic, just work. But every now and then there'd be a page where the handwriting changed shape for a line or two, pressed harder, written faster, like somebody had stopped recording routine and started writing under pressure. A few pages back, near the margin on a later night round, I found a name in a hand that wasn't Clint's. Brett. Just once at the end of an entry, like somebody signing off on a check. I turned more pages, found it again in older sections, same hand, same clipped style. That by itself meant nothing except that Brett Tolland had really been here, had really done this job, had really stood in the same office with the same board, the same phone, and the same camera screens glowing in the dark. Then I found the line that made the room go colder. It wasn't a full note. It wasn't even a complete sentence. Just something jammed into the margin beside a routine entry in writing, harder and tighter than the rest. Don't answer if it already knows who you are. I stared at it long enough for the letters to stop looking like letters. No explanation under it. No incident report. No mention of what had happened before or after. Just that one line left in the margin like a man who had run out of space, time, or nerve. Brett hadn't just stopped coming in. Brett had learned something first. I stood there with my thumb pressed into the edge of the paper and thought about the way Clint had answered when I asked what happened to him. No shrug, no annoyance, no story about a man quitting and leaving them short-handed. Just, he stopped coming in. That wasn't how you talked about a guy who found a better job. That was how you talked about somebody who had still technically existed after the useful version of them was already gone. I didn't know what had happened to Brett. I still don't. I didn't know if he'd said his name first into that phone, or called twice into the dark, or opened the wrong door, or looked too soon, or crossed at the wrong moment while some mare watched him do it. I only knew he had left enough behind to tell the next man the pattern if the next man was slow enough, scared enough, and cornered enough to finally see it. And I had already given too much. I had looked. I'd gone to the fence. I had nearly called again. I'd stood outside the feed room and listened to something eat. I'd shifted toward the wash stall before the mare looked away. I'd answered the phone. I hadn't said my name. Not yet. But that no longer felt like some neat technical victory. The thing in the farm had already reached for me in Evan's voice, already pulled me down the aisle after it, already found the deepest place in me and pressed hard enough to move my feet. That was contact, whether I wanted the word or not. Night 3 stopped being about getting to morning right there. The shift, the logbook, the stalls, the cameras, the board, all of it dropped away behind the one fact that mattered now. I was no longer trying to finish a job. I was trying to get off that property before the thing there got one more clean confirmation from me. One more answer, one more turn, one more step taken into the wrong place at the wrong time. Because once the pattern was visible, so was the edge of it. And I was standing too close. Once I understood what the rules were really doing, the whole farm changed shape around me. Not physically. The stalls were still where they'd been. The office was still lit the same way. The camera screens still hummed. But every ordinary thing on that property now felt like part of a conversation I had been dragged into without realizing it. And I finally understood the only way to survive it. Stop answering. I took the logbook page with Brett's note still in my head and backed out of the office again. I didn't turn my back on the doorway right away. I didn't speak. I didn't look too long into any one dark space. It felt stupid and precise at the same time, like trying to move through a room full of tripwires I couldn't actually see. The barn had gone too quiet again. That was becoming its own kind of warning, not the natural quiet of animals settling. This was something tighter, the kind of stillness that made every sound afterward feel chosen. I moved down the main aisle because I needed my truck keys and flashlight, and because standing still in the office felt too much like waiting for the next move from something that already believed I was engaged with it. The mares watched me as I passed. Not all of them. Just enough that I noticed. One lifted her head and kept it there. Another shifted sideways in straw and held that position like she didn't want her shoulder facing the dark end of the barn. Then the office phone rang again behind me. One clean ring. I stopped, but I didn't turn. The sound cut down the aisle and sat there in the wood and metal like it had weight. I knew what it wanted now, not just attention, not just fear. A response shaped the right way, a name, a correction, a question. Anything that finished the line. It rang a second time. I kept walking. That was when I heard Evan's voice from somewhere off to my right, not from the office, not from the phone, but from deeper in the barn complex where the path ran toward the smaller building behind the main aisle. Not loud, not dramatic, just close enough. Landon. I stopped again before I could help it. My whole body turned toward that voice without permission. That was the part of me it still had. Reflex, the old damage, the need to fix the one call I hadn't answered by answering every impossible one after it. Then it came again, a little weaker, carrying from the direction of the foaling barn this time. It didn't sound exactly like him. It sounded like whatever it was had learned how close it needed to get and didn't care about perfect. The barn stayed still around me. No kicking, no sudden panic, just that pressure in the air, like the property itself was holding its breath to see what I'd do. I knew then that if I went toward that voice, I was done. Not in some simple way I could name. Worse than that. I would be agreeing to the wrong thing one more time, looking where it wanted, moving where it called, giving it another clean step in my direction. Maybe the final one. The phone rang a third time behind me. Then, from the dark ahead, a voice said, "Say your name." Everything in me went cold. It wasn't Evan's voice that time. It was flatter than that, almost human until you listened too closely. Near enough to trigger recognition, wrong enough to make recognition feel dangerous. I kept my eyes level, not into the stall openings, not down the side path toward the foaling barn, not back toward the office. Just level. "Not tonight," I said. My own voice sounded smaller than I wanted, but it held. Nothing answered right away. Then something moved where I wasn't looking directly. Not a full shape. More like a correction in the dark, as if some part of the barn had been standing wrong and had just shifted its weight. One of the mares at the far end struck her stall once, hard, then went dead still. I walked faster after that, not running. Running would have turned it into a chase, and I had become convinced by then that the farm wanted my reactions more than it wanted my body. I kept moving toward the main door, keys already in my hand, every nerve in me waiting for another voice, another ring, another invitation shaped like urgency. I heard one more sound before I reached the lot. Not words, just breathing behind me, too close for the open space I was crossing, like someone had come up over my shoulder without making the gravel speak. I got the truck door open on the second try because my hand slipped the first time, threw myself in, locked it, and started the engine hard enough to grind for half a second before it caught. The barn lights stayed where they were. The fences stayed white under them. Nothing came out after me. Nothing showed itself cleanly. That almost made it worse, because it left room for the idea that maybe the last thing it needed was one more reply, and I had denied it just barely in time. I drove out too fast, tires hissing on gravel, and didn't look in the mirror until I hit the county road. Even then, I only looked once. There was nothing behind me but darkness and the gate. I didn't go back. At sunrise, I called Clint from a gas station outside town and told him I was done. I kept it short. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for details. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a little too long, and then he said he'd mark me off the schedule. That was it. No surprise in his voice, no attempt to keep me. Just the sound of a man who had heard that decision before and knew better than to make anybody explain it. I never told him about Brett's note. I never told anybody at the farm anything. Weeks passed, then more. Evan got stronger by degrees that only looked small if you didn't love him. He came home thin and tired and mean in the way sick people get when they hate needing help. I took the extra shifts I could find anywhere else, loading dock, inventory, delivery runs, anything that paid and ended under lights I trusted. Life didn't go back to normal, but it resumed enough to pretend at it. Then, one night, a little after 3 a.m., my phone lit up on the nightstand. I woke before the second vibration. For 1 second, I just stared at the screen in the dark, every part of me already knowing what I was going to do. Unknown number, no location, no name. I let it ring once. It stopped. Then it rang again. I answered and said nothing. There was breathing on the line, faint, patient. Then a voice, far enough away now to be almost gentle, said, "You there?" I closed my eyes and kept my mouth shut. That's the rule I brought home from Briar Run. I left that farm after the third night, but not everything there stayed behind. If a phone wakes me after 3 a.m., I answer on the second ring, and I never say my name first.